So if you have any questions, I hope I'll be able to answer. Since I'm not the main researcher, I'm a co-author of this presentation, so hopefully I'll be able to answer your question. Some of you may have heard a more extended version of this paper, which was presented here last year at the Coesit on Italian dialects. So the aim of this paper is to analyze the relation that second and third generation Italian migrants in Australia have with their own dialect. Like all other established migrant groups, Italian have been showing a steady shift away from their Italian languages towards the exclusive use of English. This shift in language use is not uncommon when different languages come into contact. In many different parts of the world, speech communities often prefer more prestigious varieties over their traditional languages. Scholars such as De Mauro and Vedovelli point out that the use of both Italian and dialect decreases in the second and subsequent generations of migrants. Italian dialects are in a weaker position in the linguistic repertoire of Italian migrants, and that is not surprising. Even in Italy, the position of dialects has been undermined by regional Italian, Italiano Popolare, and standard or neo-standard Italian. Regional Italian is a diatopic variety. That means that it is related to a specific region. However, with region, we do not mean, the term region does not necessarily coincide with one of the 20 administrative districts or regions of Italy, but rather to linguistic regions, areas that can vary in dimensions, density, and number of speakers of a specific local variant. Regional Italian is often a spoken variety, even though regionality is not excluded from the written language altogether. Italiano Popolare, instead, is a diastratic variety which reflects the level of education and the status of the speaker. As Cavallaro has cautioned us to remember, however, the term dialect in the Italian context differs significantly from the definition normally given to dialect within the English context. In English dialectology, the term dialect is traditionally synonymous with language variety. In the Italian context, it is used to refer to Italo-Romance dialect, which are not varieties of Italian. A variety of Italian is Italiano regionale, for example. The Italian dialects are autonomous linguistic systems, and in many cases they're not mutually intelligible, even though mutual intelligibility is not a criterion to distinguish dialects. It's just that they sprung from Latin as much as Italian did. So even if Italiano Popolare, regional and standard Italian were favored until the end of last century, more recent data seem to point towards a stabilization in the use of dialects in certain domains, such as family. A recent study carried out by Maria D'Agostino reveals that more and more young people in Sicily use dialect in all sorts of domains, and even resort to code switching and code mixing, either for a comic effect in informal situations among their peers, or because dialect is perceived as more colorful or more expressive, and this both informal and informal situations, formal and informal situations. So contrary to our expectations, the survey we carried out showed that dialect is not bad among the youngest generation of Australian of Italian descent. Now, the data presented in this paper is the result of a survey carried out at the Università del Piemonte Orientale, Politecnico di Milano, Monash University and Latrobe University of Melbourne, the Italian Cultural Institutes of Sydney and Melbourne. A questionnaire model on denier and Césaire was circulated among young Australians of Italian descent, age range 18 to 25, all of them learners of Italian as a second language. The corpus of this specific data consists of 42 questionnaires. Now, we are aware of the limits of a tool such as this type of questionnaire. Data are always based on informants' perception of their own language, not on elicitation of real speech in real situation. Nonetheless, a carefully devised questionnaire remains an efficient way of collecting comparable sociolinguistic data. The information gathered is fairly complete in relation to the objectives set by the present study, and anyway, it has been later expanded with interviews. Unfortunately, I didn't include any of that in this presentation. Now, the most common Italian dialects in our sample are Sicilian and Calabrese, which confirms the data, nothing new under the sun. but Triestino, Napolitano, and Romanesco are also present. Now, the main objectives of this study are to understand in which context dialect is preferred to Italian, and to assess the perception of the importance of dialect in the shaping of the speaker's self and social identity. According to Ox, the relation of language to social identity is not direct, but rather is mediated by the interlocutor's understanding of conventions for doing particular social acts in social groups, quote unquote. It is exactly this relation that we wish to explore. The context of analysis, of course, Australia, which is a truly multilingual and transcultural country. Now, the living languages in Australia, and this data was gathered from the website Ethnologue, are 206 currently. Just want to take a minute to say that in 2005 there were 231, and in 2015 there were 212, and today there are 206. I would like to let that sink in for a second. And of course, most of these, so 196 are Aboriginal and Torres Island languages. And the other are languages other than English spoken by migrant communities. The group of first-generation Italian migrant is still one of the largest non-English speaking group in Australia. According to the 2006 census, the community of first-generation Italian migrants consists of around 220,000. According to the website Ethnologue, there are 300,000 speakers of Italian in Australia. Now, the Italian community in Australia has undergone a significant change, particularly in its linguistic makeup. The Italian Australians form a very complex speech community, and that is in contrast with the widespread but erroneous belief. That was my previous slide. And that is in contrast with the widespread but erroneous belief that Italians speak Italian. In reality, the community, as linguists know, is linguistically fragmented, and its members speak either a dialect, a regional or a popular variety of Italian, a standard or a near standard Italian, or a mixture of this variety, as Nina Rubino has told us. Now, this linguistic fragmentation is a factor that contributes to the intergenerational shift to English within the Italian community. Until the 1960s, most Italians who migrated to Australia only spoke their local dialects and or a form of Italiano Popolare, which is also why a lot of clubs in Melbourne, and I'm guessing in other parts of Australia, you will see Abruzzo Club, Veneto Club. They have this regional connotation because people would tend to get together and speak their language, which wasn't Italian. Very few people spoke standard Italian, and even fewer spoke English. Language, then, has always been a key issue for Italian migrants. Italians in Australia quickly realized that economic success was associated with how well and how fast they, and particularly their children, could master the English language. Acquiring the use of English has been difficult for many generations of migrants. Since the mid-1970s, two aspects concerning Italians in Australia have come to the forefront. One is, of course, the aging of the first generation of migrants, and second is the growing numbers of second and subsequent generations. So, indeed, the main change that the Italian community has experienced is that now it's well into its third and fourth generation. Now, within this context, contact language such as Australo-Italian has emerged as a result of the mixing of the host language with the ethnic language. And by ethnic language, we mean the language of origin that one inherits from its community, also known as lingua familiare, family language, the language of primary socialization, lingua di comunità, community language, that is the language acquired within a community which maintains its ethnic language. Researchers such as Gonzo and Saltarelli and Klein argue that the use of Australo-Italian should not be discouraged by trying to maintain the linguistic norms of the ethnic language or the language of origin. Klein proposes that because of its inconsistency and lack of norms, Australo-Italian is purely a confirmation of the influence of English on the varieties of Italian present in Australia. Australo-Italian is described as a speech variety that is obviously Italian or dialect, but strongly influenced by Australian English on a lexical, phonological, syntactic, pragmatic, or semantic level. Klein stresses the fact that, and I'm quoting, there are as many varieties of community languages in Australia as there are speakers, end quote. Now, these varieties are, or used to be, heavily stigmatized, both by the English-speaking majority and by the members of the Italian-Australian community. Bertoni and Gibbons carried out a series of studies to assess the attitudes of the Italian community in Sydney towards English and the attitude towards the different varieties of Italian spoken in Australia. The result shows that English and Standard Italian were rated favorably both on traits such as solidarity, that is on the likable, unpleasant, and made stranger axis, and power, that is on the rich, poor, educated, uneducated axis. Cavallaro distinguishes between a light and a heavy mixture. A light mixture consists of some English transfers on regional Italian, and a heavy mixture consists of a substantial number of English transfers on a base of an Italian dialect. His study shows that a light mixture was rated neutral or unmarked for the same traits, while the heavy mixture was found to be strongly stigmatized on all traits. These heavy mixture varieties are heavily stigmatized both by the English-speaking majority and by the members of the Italian-Australian community. Language attitude studies have also shown that all the Italian varieties in Australia hold lower status compared to English. Even Standard Italian in Australia is rated relatively low in importance and prestige when compared to English. Now, De Mauro's definition of spazio linguistico or linguistic space proves particularly useful at this point. De Mauro states that when we shape a word linguistically, we create a space of utterance, uno spazio enunciativo, that can oscillate between different levels of formality and different varieties of languages, dialects, and contaminations between them. Within that space, different realizations according to the diatopic and diastratic variety of the speaker can materialize. Now, the linguistic repertoire of a speaker can therefore be very narrow, but at the same time widely shared, whereas other speakers can have a wider linguistic repertoire, but share it with fewer speakers. The margins of this oscillation define a linguistic space, within which every possible space of utterance finds place. Now, let's keep in mind that in the same Italian spazio linguistico, dialect is often considered an inferior variety. Now, move on to our findings. The linguistic behavior of our informants seem to be heavily influenced by their self-analysis, as Nina was saying this morning, of their linguistic competence. This relates not only to their self-evaluation of their knowledge of grammar and the structure of Italian, but also in their perception of the status of the variant that they speak, and the stereotypes and prejudice associated to it. The choice of the linguistic code the speaker uses in communication reflects the value that the speaker gives to the language, the perception they have about it, about the interlocutor, and about a context where they feel that specific variety should be used. Now, the linguistic space of our informants is quite complex, particularly in relation to spoken Italian and dialect. Now, though most of the informants claim that they only understand their dialect, 1/3 of them claim that they can actually speak it. Nearly all the informants, however, consider dialect, and that was the surprising data for us, that dialect is an important part of their cultural identity, and about half of them claim that they would actually want to learn dialect. Some of the people that we interviewed actually said that to them Italian is can I just repeat the sentence, because it was a very interesting talk. She said it's more important, sì, dialetto più importante dell'italiano perché l'italiano è sempre là. Clearly talking, so Italian is always there in the sense that there's always schools where you can go and learn Italian, but once your dialect is lost, that's a loss. And a very young, beautiful Australian Italian actor of Sicilian descent was adamant about teaching Sicilian to his children. Adamant. And on his CV he's got languages spoken: Italian, English, Italian, Sicilian. Well, in an accents that they can put on, and one of his key things was that he could speak, and he put it in the languages. So the attitude of the informants towards their dialect was overall positive, and so is their attitude towards the multilingualism of their generation, even though it sometimes has a dual effect. While they perceive it and cherish their dialect as an important part of their identity on the one hand, on the other hand they feel that it interferes with their Italian learning process, which is something that is well known. Now, the status of the language and the stereotype associated with the variants spoken by Italian migrants play a key role in the speaker's perception and use of the language. For example, the weight of the great cultural heritage of the Italian language is still felt today by migrants of most generations. Now, the result of our survey confirms the conclusion drawn by Bertoni and Rubino and shows a different distribution of the two domains. Italian is more often used in public and formal circumstances. Speaking about the different domains of use, Italian linguist Gaetano Berruto coined a term specific to the Italian situation, which is dilalia, to distinguish it from diglossia, which according to Berruto is no longer applicable to the peculiar Italian sociolinguistic situation. Now, in diglossic linguistic community, you have an A language and a B language. The A language is a standard variety, is used only in formal situations, where the B language is the lower variety, is used in informal situation. The B variety is considered a native language, is acquired, and is the language of primary socialization, where the A variety is learned at school and is the language of secondary socialization. The two cannot coexist, and they have separate functions. The word dilalia is a compound, of course, this to and lalo from the Greek to chat, and the main difference is that in informal situations both variants are used, so hence the name. Now, the A language in the dialectic situation, I have to point this, can be the native language and is indeed used for primary socialization. My generation is the first generation that speaks Italian as a first language. This is clearly not the case of second and third generation Italian migrants in Australia, but it is likely to have been the situation of their parents or grandparents. Now, let's look at, so interesting, while for Maria D'Agostino reports that young people in Sicily are moving towards what she defined a post-dialectic model, among Italians in Australia, the different domains are still separated, but that is it is obvious because they live far from the center of the language. Now let's look at the perception. Some numbers, yeah? So 61% of the informants consider dialect important, even if not as important as Italian. 55% said that they would like to learn their dialect. 33% of the informants claim that they can actually speak their parents' dialect. Just 5% of the informants said that they would use dialect with friends or other people of the same age, both in the Italian community in Australia or with people who live in Italy. 73% perceive dialect as the language of the family, especially in relation to older member. We even had a student who had to run to the hospital because they called an interpreter, but the interpreter could only speak Italian. and his old aunt couldn't speak Italian, we could speak only Salernitano, and so they had to call the guy to interpret. Now, as we said on the downside, some people perceive that it interferes with their Italian learning process. Now, our findings confirm that the majority of the Italian Australian community speaks a form of regional Italian, sometimes wrongly perceived as dialect, and that second generation subjects declare to choose Italian with co-regional interlocutors in the more public domains. In an intergenerational perspective, Italian seems to be maintained more than dialect, as among second and subsequent generation subjects, the use of Italian decreases less than the use of dialects in most domains. So here are the numbers again. 5% claim that they can understand dialect and speak it fluently. Most of them state they can only understand it. 59.5% state that their family dialect is used more than Italian, but we must not forget that some of them might not know the difference between dialect and regional Italian. So, dialect can be considered still alive among second and third generation Italian migrants. Our research reveals that dialect is perceived, indeed, by young Italian Australian as an essential tool to reconnect with their roots in the transcultural space inhabited by Italian migrants in Australia. Very quickly, I have to acknowledge the Dr. Michela Barizonzi, Monash University, Bridget Mayer, the Italian Cultural Institutes of Melbourne and Sydney, Globo Rete Italia, SBS Italia, Coasic Museo Italiano, Centro Isole Olie, all people who contributed to this research output. And recently, more extended version of this presentation has been published. There are the details. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.